Well, good evening, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's great to be in Berlin again. I want to start by sharing a couple of anecdotes with you regarding how I came to work on these issues. My research has not really been about inequality, and it's fair to say that the institution that I work for, the IMF, hasn't had a lot of things to say about inequality and why it's a problem, the kinds of issues that the two previous speakers have focused on and what this conference is about. I came to it through a much more kind of orthodox for the IMF sort of route, which is I was doing work on economic growth. And really, the question that we were focusing on was what makes economic growth sustained. And the reason that's important for the fund and for our members is that we're always looking for where the next crisis is, and we focus on currency crises, on banking crises, et cetera, but fundamentally, what we're really worried about is growth crises. And when you look at a lot of the literature on economic growth, a lot of it is focused on sort of panel regressions, 5-year panels typically, trying to correlate growth performance in these blocks of time with different economic indicators. But for much of the IMF's membership, for most countries, the vast majority of countries in the world, economic growth is not a smooth process that we come to sort of think about when we look at rich countries. It's really very, very messy and very bumpy with sharp peaks, plateaus, valleys, and so on. So approaching this, looking at it from a sort of panel regression approach, really is not going to be very helpful for understanding the growth process in much of the emerging and developing world. And so we asked this question, what makes growth sustained? What we were really looking at it is, what are the hazards to growth? It turns out that initiating growth is much easier than sustaining growth. So even countries that one might describe as economic basket cases have had some success in initiating growth. But they've had much less success in sustaining growth. And it's obviously the ability to sustain growth that's the key to longer run development. And so we wrote a paper a few years back with that title, What Makes Growth Sustained? And we weren't looking for anything to do with inequality or the distribution of income as something that might be important here. And indeed, what we emphasized in the paper were a whole host of factors which one might describe as Washington consensus type of factors. Openness to trade, low inflation, sound fiscal policy, the whole menu that orthodox economists believe is important for sustained economic growth and stability. But one of the things that was buried in this paper was a very robust role for the distribution of income. And when the paper was published, we did talk about this, but we didn't make heavy weather of it. It was there, and in our view, we said very clearly, the income distribution belongs in what economists think of as the pantheon of factors that are important for understanding what makes growth sustained. But we mentioned it as one of those factors. So that's anecdote one. Anecdote two is how we really came to write a series of papers that had inequality as a key actor. Now that came about really also by serendipity. It was a time when the Occupy movements, the Arab Spring, a lot of things were going on socially in the world that seemed to be focused on the distribution of income. And we at the IMF kind of felt a bit sidelined by all the debates that were going on here. And yet we are an institution that is meant to advise countries on some of the challenges that are posed by globalization, and inequality seemed indeed to be one such challenge. Yet inequality is nowhere in our Constitution, in our Articles of Agreement. And so a challenge was put to the staff, well, how do we make this, how do we get invited to the table to talk about these issues? And I sheepishly put up my hand and said, well, our Constitution does put economic growth and stability at the center of our mandate, and that's what we talk to all of our member countries when we do annual health checks of their economies. So if you can draw a tight link or some link between the distribution of income and growth and stability, you should have something to say about these issues. And so, we were asked to do some work on this, and that's how we sort of married what was a kind of peripheral issue for the fund to some very mainline issues. Now, as the previous two speakers, and I'm sure this conference itself is focusing on, you say anything about inequality now, it's a very, very hot topic. And it's a hot topic for the reasons that the previous speakers have focused on. It seems to be of first order importance in understanding why we had the crisis that we've just gone through. And very, very salient books have been written on this. Joe's book, Raghu Rajan's book, I think are must-reads in this connection. In addition, there is a kind of a much longer-standing literature, I think, that focuses on the relationship between inequality and economic growth, and I'll talk a little bit about that literature in a bit. But call it biased, my interpretation of the empirical evidence is that equality tends to be positively related to sustained economic growth. I think the weight of the evidence is much more in that direction than the opposite. There are of course papers, empirical papers that argue that inequality is actually more favorable to economic growth. I think a lot of those papers are picking up shorter term correlations than the medium to long run ones that I'm focusing on. But so, coming to the paper that I'm going to talk about today, not the ones that I rambled on about a second ago, it's one thing to say that inequality is inimical to, or antithetical to growth, but it's quite another to draw policy conclusions from that. The simple reason being that the most obvious cure for inequality, redistribution, might itself be very bad for growth. And certainly, I think Tom Sargent, when he talked about 10 truths that economists really, really know, in a lecture recently, he said that incentives are very important and inequality is essential for incentives and therefore for economic growth. So there is a deep-seated conviction in economists' minds that inequality really is fundamental to economic growth, and that the more important, what I'm saying here, that the cure for inequality, redistribution, is very bad for growth. This idea of a leaky bucket that owes to Arthur Oken's book on equality and efficiency back in the 70s. So this is a case where the cure might be worse than the disease. And so we want to look empirically, really, at the connections amongst these three variables: inequality, redistribution, and growth. And it's something that we've wanted to do for a while, but only recently have been able to do because of some data that we became aware of. That's actually fairly recent. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we came to this literature really looking at the sustainability of growth. But, you know, in this paper, in order to connect with the growth, the empirical growth traditional literature which looks at panel growth regressions, we decided we would do both in this paper. We would look at hazard models of what makes growth sustained, but we would also look at more traditional growth regressions. And so we run these two things in parallel. We do both. But the novel thing here is that we are able to distinguish between market and net inequality. So before the fiscal system comes into play and after the fiscal system comes into play. And therefore we'll be able to get a direct measure of redistribution, as well as assessing you know, the effect of net distribution, net income distribution on economic growth. We think that net income distribution is really where the incentives will be beginning to bite. And just to anticipate the conclusion, what we find is that on average in our sample of countries, redistribution is basically benign. So this deep-seated conviction that redistribution is really a cure that's worse than the disease, we don't find any support for that in the macro data that we use, unless redistribution is extreme. And we think that's probably an intuitive observation to make, because we tend to think of the costs of taxation on redistributive measures to be convex, so rising at an increasing rate. And so it's plausible to us that extreme efforts to redistribute might be harmful. But given that our base finding is that the sort of average non-extreme redistributive measure is benign, it means that redistribution actually is a pro-growth policy. Why? Because redistribution has a favorable effect on the level of post-tax equality. And equality is a robust, favorable determinant of economic growth. So when you take from the rich and give to the poor, the direct effect of that measure is basically benign, but the indirect effect, operating through greater equality, is protective of growth. It leads to higher growth and more stable, less fragile growth. Now, that's my story. I'm gonna, obviously in the time remaining, try and put a little bit of meat on that. There are many moving parts here to this story, and we're going to focus on a few of them. We're going to focus on the direct effects of redistribution, the direct effects of net inequality on growth, and we're going to focus on the indirect effects of redistribution operating through equality and therefore to growth. In the background, we don't have a theory of what determines the market inequality that's generated by the capitalist system, so that for us is going to be essentially exogenous. Now, as I mentioned, there's a huge literature here, and it's you know, like all things in economics, there are arguments on both sides. Certainly, there is my PhD is from the University of Chicago, so I was pro inequality before I became against inequality. But certainly, one of the things that you really do get ingrained is the importance of incentives, and there's a long literature on the importance of incentives and the role of inequality in encouraging saving and capital accumulation and so on. There's very old literature going back to Nicky Calder on this. There's modern incarnations of this in Barrow. And as I mentioned, there is a well-cited paper by Kristen Forbes on this, but we talk about that paper in our paper. I believe it's basically a shorter run issue that she's uncovering. There are, of course, very you know, important reasons why equality may be favorable for growth. If you improve the access of the poor to health, to nutrition, to education, that's likely to be pro-growth. If inequality is associated with political instability and political instability is associated with low investment, that's antithetical to growth. If countries that are highly unequal are unable to build the social consensus that is necessary to solve problems when bad shocks occur, that is likely to be a problem for growth. So there are all sorts of reasons why more equality might be favorable to growth, and there is empirical evidence also suggesting that. I think the weight of the empirical evidence is in that direction. There is another issue that's important in the background here, and it's related to some of the things that the previous speakers talked about, which is, the political economy of how market inequality affects pressures to redistribute. So the seminal paper here is by Metzler and Richard, and it basically argues that more unequal societies face more pressures to redistribute. And so there's a positive relationship between inequality and redistribution. It's basically the median voter theorem in action. Political power is more evenly distributed than economic power, and the poor put pressure to redistribute. Now, of course, if you believe that our democracies are bought and paid for, then there's no particular reason that this relationship would hold. It may be that indeed political power is as unevenly distributed as economic power if the rich control the political process. So it's an empirical question. Most of the papers since Metzler and Richard wrote their paper suggests that the median voter theorem works. And so finally, the bottom line, how does redistribution affect growth? There's a direct and an indirect effect, as I argued. What we're going to argue in this paper. Has the mic gone off? Yeah, it seems like it. It's okay. What we're going to argue in this paper is that the indirect effect is extremely important, and in all but very extreme cases dominates. Now, you guys are all experts on inequality. I am not. I was struck by when we started working on these issues 5-6 years ago was what a horrible mess the data on inequality are, something I'm sure we all share, and how the different papers use different concepts of inequality, often without tremendous care, and we share in that guilt. And so it also makes interpretation of empirical evidence very, very difficult, and especially so when it comes to interpreting the evidence on redistribution. Not least because, direct measures of redistribution were not widely available until very recently, and oftentimes what people were doing were proxying redistribution by some measures like the size of the state, which is a very imperfect proxy at best. We became aware not too long ago of the work of Frederick Solt at the University of Iowa, the SWID database, and we thought it was well suited to our needs. It is not perfect, and Fred would be the first to admit that it is not perfect. But it is really the only database in existence to my knowledge, and certainly the collected knowledge here must be very large indeed. So if I'm wrong on this, I'm sure you'll set me straight. It is the only database in existence that can be used to answer the question that we are putting in our paper. So it's not perfect, but it's the best that's available. Now, we are going to talk about regression results. Miriam, what have I got left? 15 minutes. Okay. That's fine. So we're going to talk about regressions and the empirics in a bit, but it's good to get a feel for what the data say. And what this figure shows you is really the two worlds, the rich world and the non-rich world. And the fact that market inequality seems to have been relatively stable in the world as a whole, but it masks two different trends, rising inequality in the rich world and in the non-OECD countries, a welcome development of falling market inequality. It also shows, what I'm sure we all know, that rich countries redistribute more than non-rich countries. They have more developed, more robust fiscal systems to do this. You can look at this in the cross-section, and you see essentially the same thing. Most countries redistribute, but OECD countries do more of it than non-OECD countries. And you also see that the more unequal countries, the more redistribution they tend to do. So you see that countries that are far off to the right in the panels in terms of market inequality tend to be also further below the 45-degree line, suggesting more redistribution. I want to briefly mention, since I talked about the Metzler-Richard effect, that we do find some support for it in our paper. We find that it holds more strongly in OECD countries, not surprising, given their more robust fiscal systems, than in non-OECD countries, but it holds everywhere. And, you know, it gives me some pause. My co-authors, we have debates about this. It gives me some pause about whether the line that really the system is bought and paid for is really true in our data. I'm not so sure. I would have been more partial, more sympathetic to that line of reasoning if we had found less support for Metzler-Richard than in fact we do. Again, before I get into the regressions, I want to show you what just the raw data show. And remember, we have we're going to be both talking about panels, and we're going to be talking about hazards. And so here is just a naive look at the Gini, the net Gini, and growth over the next decade, and also redistribution and growth over the next decade. And, you know, it looks to me that we have a negative relation between the Gini and future growth. And it doesn't look to me like there's a whole lot there in terms of redistribution and future growth. You do the same thing with hazards. So you can ask, if a country's in a growth spell and it is more unequal, how long is that growth spell going to last? And so here on the left hand, you're looking at the correlation between the duration of growth and the Gini, the net Gini. And on the right panel, you're looking at the same thing in terms of redistribution. So the difference between market and net Gini and the duration. And again, my reading of this picture is that you know, it looks like duration and inequality are negatively correlated. More unequal societies tend to have more fragile, less sustained growth. But it doesn't look to me like there's a whole lot there between redistribution and the sustainability, the duration of growth spells. So I'm going to spend the last bit talking about our empirical approach and some policy messages. So basically, this is the panel part, and we do it in a very conventional way. We first of all focus on the main variables of interest to us, which is inequality and redistribution. And then we gradually add things that the literature before us believes are important and belong in growth regressions. So we add the factors of production, and we add a range of other determinants that are traditionally on the right-hand side of these growth regressions. And what we find is really what I alluded to earlier, which is that no matter what we do, inequality seems to be bad for the level of growth. So in the basic stripped-down model, in the model that adds the productive factors, and in the richer model that has a wealth of other determinants. Redistribution rarely, if ever, comes in significant. We ran many of these regressions. Rarely does it come in significant. You might have priors that the effects of either or both of these variables is nonlinear. You might think that the effect of inequality on growth depends on the level of inequality. You might think that, as I argued at the beginning, the level of redistribution, the effect of redistribution on growth might depend on how extensive redistribution is. We find no evidence in these panels of nonlinear effects with respect either to inequality or to growth. And most important of all for us, we decisively reject the notion that, if you redistribute, the effect of that redistribution is as bad for growth as the benefit you might get from the resulting increase in equality. If that were the case, we would have the two coefficients being roughly equal and opposite in sign in the regression, and both statistically significant. We don't. So effectively from this set of regressions, we infer that redistribution is on the whole a pro-growth policy, and it mainly affects growth through its impact on the improvement in the distribution of income. Incentive effects, the leaky bucket that Arthur Okun wrote a book about, do not seem to be, to us, very salient in the macro data. Here is a picture of what we find, and you see the bar on the left sort of quantitatively measuring the direct effect of equality. The small and insignificant effect of redistribution is in the middle, and then the total effect combining the two is in the right bar chart. So redistribution is favorable to growth. We've done a battery of robustness checks. Most important, we've done, given all the questions about the SWID data, we've done robustness with respect to different different ways of using that SOLT database. We use his full database. We use our baseline, which excludes a number of problematic observations. And then we use a restricted database that essentially excludes all the information from developing countries prior to the mid-'80s. So only the highest quality data. And we get that our results basically are substantively unchanged, independent of which version we use. I want to briefly spend a couple minutes on the hazards. So the idea of the hazard is you're asking, it comes from the medical literature, you're asking, conditional on being a spell, what's the probability of a heart attack? What's the probability that the spell will end? And we follow a very similar procedure to what we did in the panels. So we do a very stripped down version of the model, only focusing on the two variables of interest. Then we gradually build it up, including the factors of production, and then many of the other variables that we had in our previous papers on the hazard model and that are popular in the empirical growth literature. The only sort of thing I want to mention here is here we do find some support for nonlinearities. Not with respect to inequality. We don't find that an increase in inequality, the effect of an increase in inequality has substantively different effects on your hazard depending on the level of inequality. But we do find that the hazard of more redistribution does depend on how much redistribution you're already doing. Now, we find that the break in this relationship occurs roughly at the 75th percentile of the redistribution distribution. So if you're in that top quartile, you probably want to think about doing more. We find that doing more is actually bad for growth, but for the median and for the bottom three quartiles, we don't find any such effect. And it's important, of course, if you are doing redistribution, you're doing it primarily, I would assume, for distributive reasons. So even for extreme redistributors, we don't find a statistically significant effect, a statistically significant adverse effect of redistribution on growth. So you might still want to do it, though you won't be doing it for growth reasons. For everybody else, we find that it's a pro-growth policy. This is just a picture of who in our sample are in the top quartile. So you're in the top quartile if you're below the the dashed 45-degree line in this picture. And here basically is a picture of what I said. So the left-hand bar is the direct effect on the hazard of the level of inequality. The next two bars are what happens when you're an extreme redistributor, i.e. you're in the top quartile, and basically here you see that the point estimate is against growth. It increases the hazard. It's, you know, it increases the probability that conditional on being in a spell, you will exit that spell. But for the other three quartiles, and for the median in particular, again, redistribution is favorable to growth stability. It's favorable to increasing the length of your spell, conditional on being in that spell. Again, we do a range of robustness tests, and here it's fair to say that the results are more fragile. In particular, if we exclude all of the information prior to the mid-'80s for developing countries, we no longer have the favorable effect of equality on the sustainability of growth. Why is that? Because analysis of spells requires looking at long periods of time. And when we exclude the older data, we exclude many of the spells that are the object of our analysis. So it is not surprising to us that when you exclude so much information, it's very difficult for the remaining data to speak. Conclusions, and I'm just going to read out my last slide. Basically, our result is that consistent with our previous work, and now using both panels and hazards, inequality remains a powerful determinant of the level and sustainability of growth. We find little evidence of a harmful effect of redistribution on growth, except in the hazards when it is extreme. The implication we draw from this is that extreme caution about redistribution, which certainly in my institution tends to freeze you, really, from any policy action, extreme caution is not warranted by the macro evidence that we've been able to put together. On average, across countries and through times, redistribution has been a growth-favorable policy. Redistribution has not been directly antithetical to growth, and the resulting improvement in equality has been a policy that is favorable both to the level and sustainability of growth. Thank you.